On December 16, 1944, at 5:30 in the morning, a 20-year-old first lieutenant named Lyle Bouck crouched in a frozen foxhole on a hilltop above the village of Lanzerath, Belgium, and watched 500 German paratroopers marching up the road below him. He had 18 men, 4 borrowed artillery observers from Battery C of the 371st Field Artillery Battalion, a handful of Browning automatic rifles, one .30 caliber machine gun, and a stack of hand grenades they had been stockpiling for 5 quiet days, on a front so calm that the army called it the Ghost Front. The 4-towed anti-tank guns from the 820th Tank Destroyer Battalion, that had been their only armoured support, had pulled out at first light without telling them. The regiment was 7 miles behind them. The radio worked, but no one at headquarters seemed to understand what Bouck was reporting. 500 men, German paratroopers, moving in column toward his position. Bouck was from St. Louis, Missouri. His father was a carpenter. He had joined the Missouri National Guard at 14, which was 2 years below the legal age, and talked his way in because he was tall for his age, and the recruiter did not ask too many questions. By the time the Army sent him to Fort Benning's Officer Candidate School, he had already spent more time in uniform than most of the officers who would outrank him. He graduated 4th in his class. He was the second youngest man in his own platoon. His 21st birthday was the next day, December 17th, and in approximately 90 seconds he was going to decide whether 18 Americans on a frozen hilltop in the Ardennes would open fire on a force that outnumbered them nearly 30 to 1. He made the decision, but not yet, because at that moment a blonde Belgian girl walked out of a farmhouse in the village below, crossed the road, and spoke briefly with a cluster of German officers. Bouck watched through his field glasses. He held his fire. He waited until the girl turned and walked safely back inside the house. Then he gave the signal. Private Risto Milosevic opened up with a 50 caliber machine gun mounted on their jeep. The sound split the frozen morning apart. When Milosevic was wounded and the barrel overheated, Technical Sergeant Bill Slape took over and kept firing in long, sustained bursts. The column of paratroopers scattered into ditches, reformed, and attacked uphill into the trees. The Americans cut them down. The Germans pulled back, reorganized with mortar support, and attacked again. The Americans cut them down again. A third assault. A fourth. Each time, the paratroopers from Colonel Helmut von Hoffmann's 9th Fallschirmjäger Regiment left their dead in the snow and came again with more men. Each time, the 18 Americans on the hilltop sent them back. For nearly 20 hours, 18 Americans and 4 artillerymen held that hilltop against an entire battalion. They inflicted 92 casualties. Technician 5th grade Billy Queen, one of the forward artillery observers, was killed calling in fire on the German assembly area. He was the only American killed on that hilltop. By late afternoon, every surviving man in the platoon was wounded. Private First Class William Sakanicus was shot through the face. Slape had burns on his hands from the machine gun barrel. They did not retreat. They did not break. They fought until every last round of ammunition was gone, and only then, with the radio destroyed and the position finally overrun, did the Germans take them. Bouck and his survivors were dragged into the Café Scholzen in Lanzerath village and lined up against a wall. They waited, wounded, bleeding, and listening to German boots on the floor above them. A few hours before midnight, the door banged open. A German officer walked in. He was not interested in the prisoners. He was furious, not at the Americans, but at his own paratroopers. The officer was SS Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Piper, 29 years old, a former adjutant to Heinrich Himmler and one of the most decorated tank commanders in the Waffen-SS. He commanded the most powerful armored battle group in the entire German offensive, roughly 5,000 men with 100 tanks and assault guns, including Panthers, Panzer IVs, and King Tigers from the 501st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion. His orders were to reach the Meuse River bridges within 48 hours. He had been sitting in the dark on a frozen forest road for 16 hours because a platoon of teenagers from Missouri had refused to move. If this story moves you, a like helps it reach others who care about these men. And if you are new here, subscribe. Piper screamed at Colonel von Hoffmann in front of the American prisoners. He demanded the paratroopers move immediately to escort his tanks forward. The column finally lurched into motion at 4 in the morning on December 17th, 16 to 18 hours behind schedule. That delay was the central wound of the entire German offensive on the northern shoulder. Piper never reached the Meuse. He never came close. And the reason he did not, the reason the entire northern half of Hitler's last great gamble collapsed in its first 72 hours, begins with a question that German generals spent the rest of their lives trying to answer. How did a division of American soldiers who had never heard a shot fired in anger stop the most powerful Panzer army in the German order of battle? The division was the 99th Infantry Division. The men who served in it called themselves the checkerboarders, after the black, blue, and white checkerboard patch on their shoulders, a design that dated to 1923 and reflected the iron mills of Pittsburgh and the coat of arms of William Pitt the Elder. The Germans and the American press gave them a different name. They called them the Battle Babies. A United Press correspondent named John McDermott coined the nickname during the battle itself, when the division first appeared in press dispatches. It was meant to highlight their inexperience. It became the opposite. But before we get to what the Battle Babies did on Elsenborn Ridge, and before we understand the weapon that ultimately broke the 6th Panzer Army, we need to understand what was coming at them, because the force that hit the 99th Division on that December morning was not a probing attack. It was not a raid. It was the main effort of the largest German offensive on the Western Front since the fall of France in 1940, and the man commanding it was one of the most trusted and most limited officers in Adolf Hitler's inner circle. Seth S. General Joseph Dietrich, known to everyone as Sepp, was a Bavarian butcher's apprentice who had become Hitler's personal bodyguard in the early days of the Nazi movement and risen through loyalty, brutality, and political favor to command the 6th Panzer Army. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the senior German commander in the West, privately called Dietrich decent but stupid. His own chief of staff, General Fritz Kramer, conceded he was no strategic genius. Hitler did not care about any of that. After the July 20, 1944 assassination plot, Hitler distrusted most Wehrmacht officers. He gave his largest armored army to his oldest political comrade and expected the SS to deliver what the regular army could not. Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army was the most powerful single German formation assembled for Operation Watch on the Rhine. It contained 4 SS Panzer divisions. The 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, under SS Brigadier General Wilhelm Mohnke. The 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich. The 9th SS Panzer Division, Hohenstaufen. And the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, under SS Colonel Hugo Krass, a Westphalian who had studied to become a teacher before his father's death, ended that dream and pushed him into a military career, transferring from the regular army to the SS in 1935 and taking command of the division only 5 weeks before the offensive. Behind the armor were 3 Volksgrenadier divisions, a Fallschirmjäger division, and a battalion of Tiger II King Tiger tanks attached to Piper's column. Supporting operations included a parachute drop behind American lines by roughly 1,300 men under Lieutenant Colonel Friedrich August von der Heydter, and Operation Greif, Otto Skorzenny's force of English-speaking Germans in American uniforms tasked with seizing Meuse bridges. The entire timetable depended on cracking through one piece of ground, a 2,000-foot, boomerang-shaped wooded ridge east of the Belgian village of Elsenborn. The ridge dominated the road network feeding into the Allied rear. West of Elsenborn lay the gentle valleys leading to the massive American supply depots at Spa and Liège, then onward to the Meuse river crossings, and ultimately Antwerp. Whoever held the ridge held the roads, and without those roads, Dietrich could not feed, fuel, or resupply an armored corps in motion. The plan budgeted 7 days to reach Antwerp. Dietrich's spearhead was expected to cross the Meuse in 48 hours. As military historian Peter Caddick Adams argued in his study of the battle, the 6th Panzer Army had been given the most powerful forces and the most impossible terrain. No amount of combat power could force a passage through the northern shoulder if the Americans chose to block it. The Germans knew this. They planned for it. They assigned their most powerful forces to it. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, had wanted Dietrich to lead with his armor straight through the Losheim Gap, punching a hole with tanks and pouring through before the Americans could react. But Model overruled his own instinct and required the Volksgrenadier infantry divisions to crack the American line first, clearing the roads for the Panzers to exploit. It was a fateful compromise. The Volksgrenadiers were not the infantry of 1940. They were rebuilt divisions filled with former Air Force ground crews and naval personnel who had never trained as riflemen, led by cadres stretched too thin to give every platoon a competent leader. Asking these men to break an entrenched defensive line in dense forest, in winter, at night, was asking them to do the hardest thing infantry can do. And it was asking them to do it fast enough that the SS Panzers idling on the roads behind them would not lose the element of surprise. The plan had 5 designated routes, called Rollbahnen, running west from the German border to the Meuse. Rollbahnen A, B, and C were assigned to the 12th SS Panzer Division through Elsenborn, Butgenbach, and Malmedy. Rollbahnen D and E went to the 1st SS Panzer Division through Losheim and on towards Stavelot and the Meuse bridges. Every route ran through or past Elsenborn Ridge. If the ridge held, the northern 3 routes were closed, and if the northern 3 routes were closed, Dietrich's army was fighting with one arm tied behind its back. And they assumed, with what seemed like reasonable confidence, that the defenders sitting on those frozen positions would break quickly, because the unit holding that ground, strung across 19 miles of forested Belgian countryside, with no reserves and no division behind it, was the greenest, most untested formation in the entire American line. The story of the 99th Infantry Division begins not in Belgium, but in the red mud of southern Mississippi, at a place called Camp Van Dorn. The division was activated on November 15, 1942. Its first recruits arrived that winter from draft boards across Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, and other northern states. Camp Van Dorn, in December of 1942, was a tar paper shanty town where both service clubs burned to the ground before Christmas. The men slept in unheated barracks, trained in freezing rain, and wondered what they had gotten themselves into. Their first commander was Major General Thompson Lawrence, but the man who would shape the division and lead it into combat was Major General Walter Lauer, a Brooklyn-born Cornell ROTC graduate, who took command on August 2, 1943. Lauer was a First World War veteran who had served with the American Expeditionary Forces. He had been Chief of Staff of the 3rd Infantry Division during the Operation Brushwood landings at Fadala, Morocco, in November 1942. He was not a theorist. He was a man who had seen what combat did to unprepared units, and he drove the 99th through 2 years of intensive training, through the Louisiana maneuvers, and at Camp Maxey, Texas, with the energy of a man who knew his soldiers' lives depended on what they learned before they ever saw a German. But Lauer faced a problem that would have crippled a lesser commander. The Army's replacement system had bled the 99th of more than 3,000 of its best-trained soldiers, pulling them out as individual overseas replacements before the division itself shipped out. To fill the gaps, the Army sent soldiers from the Army Specialized Training Program, college students who had been studying engineering, foreign languages, and advanced mathematics at universities across the country, and who were now being told that the infantry needed them more than the classrooms did. These men were intelligent, often scoring in the top brackets of the Army General Classification Test, but they had not trained as a unit. They arrived weeks before deployment and had to be absorbed on the fly. The 99th was not a weak division. It was an untested one, assembled from spare parts and held together by a cadre of NCOs who had trained for 2 years but had never led men under fire. But here is a detail about those ASTP men that most accounts leave out, and it matters for understanding what happened later. These were soldiers who had scored in the top brackets of the Army General Classification Test. Some had been studying advanced calculus, others had been learning Japanese or German at university language programs. They were not natural infantrymen. But they were men who had been trained, in whatever capacity, to think analytically, to solve problems, to adapt. When they arrived at Camp Maxi and were told to pick up an M1 Garand and learn to be riflemen, many of them brought that habit of mind with them into the foxhole. A man who has spent a year solving differential equations does not automatically become a good soldier, but he does tend to ask why a flanking position works better than a frontal assault, and he tends to remember the answer. This mattered in the Krinkelterwald more than anyone predicted. The division also benefited from something Lauer insisted on during the final months of training. He ran his NCOs hard. He rotated squad leaders through tactical exercises that required them to operate without officer guidance. He stressed small unit problems, where the platoon leader was declared a casualty in the first 5 minutes, and the sergeant had to take over and complete the mission. It was standard American training doctrine, but Lauer enforced it with unusual rigor because he had seen in North Africa what happened when leaders went down and no one was ready to step up. Every staff sergeant in the 99th had rehearsed the moment when the lieutenant went silent, and the decision fell to him. They rehearsed it so many times that by the time they reached Belgium, the transition from officer to NCO leadership was not a crisis. It was a drill. It shipped out from the Boston port of embarkation in late September 1944, arrived in England on October 10th, landed at Le Havre on November 3rd, and moved by truck through Belgium into the line on November 9th. Its 3 infantry regiments, the 393rd under Lieutenant Colonel Gene Scott, the 394th under Colonel Don Riley, and the 395th, were each responsible for a sector roughly 7 miles wide. That was 3 to 4 times wider than what Army doctrine recommended for a single regiment. Lieutenant Colonel McClernand Butler, who commanded the 3rd Battalion of the 395th at Hofen, later wrote that his frontage was 3 to 4 times wider than recommended by Army textbooks. There was no division reserve. If the line broke anywhere, there was nothing behind it. For 5 weeks, the Ghost Front was quiet. The men dug foxholes, strung concertina wire, registered their mortars and artillery on likely approach routes, sent patrols into the forest, and listened to the silence. They did not know that on the other side of the Krinkelterwald, in assembly areas hidden beneath triple canopy pine, 250,000 German soldiers were massing for the largest surprise attack of the Western European War. Remember the name of this division. Remember what it was before December 16, 1944, a formation the Army had stripped of its best men, refilled with college students, placed on a front so quiet that senior commanders used it as a rest area for burned-out veteran divisions, and given a frontage so wide that a German assault would hit it before most of its men could reach each other. Remember that, because what the 99th did over the next 5 days would cause the historian John Eisenhower, son of the Supreme Allied Commander, to write that the action of the 2nd and 99th Divisions on the northern shoulder could be considered the most decisive of the Ardennes campaign. That is not poetry, it is a military judgment, and it carries a weight that the more famous stories of the Bulge, Bastogne, and the 101st Airborne have unfairly overshadowed for 80 years. Here is what happened. At 5:30 on the morning of December 16th, 1,600 German guns opened fire simultaneously along an 80-mile front. Nebelwerfer rocket batteries screamed overhead. Searchlights bounced off the low cloud base to create artificial moonlight over the snow-covered forest. American telephone lines were cut within minutes. Some companies lost radio contact at the same time. The ground shook so violently that men in foxholes thought they were being buried alive. The 277th Volksgrenadier Division, 3 regiments of hastily assembled infantry under General Wilhelm Wiebig, advanced through the snow against the 393rd Infantry. Many of Wiebig's soldiers were former Luftwaffe ground crew and Kriegsmarine sailors transferred to the infantry to fill the catastrophic manpower shortages of late 1944. Wiebig himself had accepted the attack order with private misgivings. He had warned his superiors that the wooded terrain favored the defenders, and that without enough riflemen for a quick breakthrough, success could only come with overwhelming artillery support. His warning was noted and ignored. His own post-war manuscript recorded that his division contained Volksdeutsche and Alsatians who constituted an untrustworthy element, and men from the Vienna area with low fighting spirit. A few hundred yards south, the 12th Volksgrenadier Division, nearly 15,000 men, and among the first German formations to receive significant quantities of the new Sturmgewehr assault rifle, pushed toward the crossroads village of Lochheimer Graben against the 394th Infantry. On the divisional left flank, at the village of Höfen, Lieutenant Colonel Butler's 3rd Battalion of the 395th, dug in behind camouflage netting and supported by a dozen towed 3-inch anti-tank guns from Company A of the 612th Tank Destroyer Battalion, fought off the 326th Volksgrenadier Division from prepared positions. The Germans advanced to within 9 feet of the American line before being shot down at point-blank range. They left their dead in the snow because they could not retrieve them. Butler's battalion held that ground for the entire battle and never withdrew a single yard. After the war, at the 99th Division's prisoner of war processing cage in Linz, Austria, a captured German lieutenant asked his American interrogator the name of the elite unit that had defended Höfen. The American told him it was the 395th Infantry, 99th Division. The German stared. He had assumed he was fighting a veteran formation that had been in combat for months. He had been stopped cold by men who had been under fire for 37 days. But Höfen was the quiet flank. The crisis was in the center and the south, where the German main effort was aimed, and the crisis produced heroes whose stories deserve to be heard in full. Technical Sergeant Vernon McGarity of Wright, Tennessee, was a squad leader in Company L of the 393rd Infantry. He was born on December 1, 1921. He had worked in the Civilian Conservation Corps before the war. He was drafted a week before his 21st birthday in 1942. He married a woman named Etheline Nunn. He had a newborn daughter he had never held. On the morning of December 16th, McGarity was wounded in the opening barrage. He made his way to a battalion aid station, was treated, and refused evacuation. He turned around and walked back to his squad, through the same shell fire that had just wounded him. Over the next day and a half, in the frozen forest east of the village of Krinkelt, McGarity rescued wounded soldiers under direct fire, immobilized the lead German tank with a single bazooka round, drove off 3 supporting tanks with the concentrated fire of his squad, crossed open ground under machine gun fire to retrieve ammunition from an abandoned position, and finally, when a German machine gun crew set up behind his squad to cut off their only escape route, stood up from cover and walked into the open. He killed the gun crew with aimed rifle fire from his M1 carbine. He fought until his squad had fired its last round. Only on the morning of December 17th was his position overwhelmed. McGarity spent the remaining months of the war as a prisoner at Stalag 7A in Moosburg, Bavaria. President Harry Truman placed the Medal of Honor around his neck in the White House on December 18, 1945. McGarity rose to lieutenant colonel in the Tennessee Army National Guard before retiring. He died in Memphis on May 21, 2013, at 91 years old. Now consider what McGarity's story tells us about the American Army of 1944. He was a technical sergeant, not an officer. He was not executing a plan handed down from a battalion command post. He was making decisions in real time, with no guidance from above, deciding which weapon to use against which target, deciding when to hold and when to move, and deciding to walk into machine gun fire because his men would die if someone did not silence that gun. No officer told him to do any of it. The officers were gone. The radio was gone. The plan was gone. What remained was a 23-year-old NCO from Tennessee who had been trained not merely to follow orders, but to understand the purpose behind them, and who could keep fighting without anyone telling him how, because he understood why. That distinction, between a soldier trained to execute and a soldier trained to think, is the invisible architecture of what happened at Elsenborn Ridge. It is the reason the 99th held when military logic said it should have broken. And it is the thing the German command structure was incapable of replicating, not because German soldiers lacked courage or intelligence, but because the German system concentrated decision-making authority in officers and distributed obedience to everyone else. The German military tradition drew a sharp line between the officer class and the enlisted ranks. An officer was not merely a leader, He was the carrier of responsibility, of the authority to decide under pressure, to rewrite the plan when circumstances changed. That authority was not shared with NCOs. It was not expected of them. A German Feldwebel, no matter how experienced, was trained to execute the framework an officer provided. If the officer fell and the mission was clear, the Feldwebel could continue it. But the act of creating a new mission from nothing, of standing at a crossroads and deciding on his own authority that this ground would be held, that was an officer's prerogative. The system spent a German NCO's entire career making sure he understood the distinction. The American system had erased that distinction before the war even started. American NCOs were trained not just to follow orders, but to understand the reasoning behind them. They were trained to take over when the officer went down. They were trained to improvise. And critically, the men beneath them, the corporals and the privates, had been trained in the same way. A private in an American rifle squad might be a man who had scored higher on the classification test than his lieutenant. He might be a man who had washed out of officer candidate school and returned to the line knowing how to read a terrain map as well as any officer. He understood the purpose of the mission, not just his own role in it. And if the mission survived and the officer did not, the squad kept moving. This meant that in the frozen forest east of Krinkelt, when communications collapsed and officers were killed or cut off, American squads did not freeze. They did what McGarity did. They did what Buch did. They looked at the ground, identified the threat, and acted, not because they were braver than their German counterparts, but because their training had given them permission to lead. Wiebig identified the problem from the German side without realizing he was describing his opponent's advantage. His 277th Volksgrenadier Division, he wrote, suffered a serious shortage of subordinate commanders at the group and platoon level. His Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine transfers could carry a rifle. They could not lead a squad when the sergeant went down. The American 99th, green as it was, had NCOs in every squad who had been trained for months in exactly that skill. The asymmetry was invisible on any order of battle chart. It was decisive in the forest. But the 99th did not hold alone, and understanding what happened next requires acknowledging a partnership that most accounts of the battle either understate or ignore entirely. The 2nd Infantry Division, one of the most experienced formations in the American Army, a unit that had landed at Omaha Beach and fought across France, was not in reserve behind the 99th on December 16th. It was attacking forward through the 99th's lines. Its commander, Major General Walter Robertson, had battalions scattered in the forest ahead of the 99th's front lines when the German barrage landed. German intelligence believed the 2nd Division was at Elsenborn in reserve. The official United States Army history records that the appearance of the 2nd Infantry Division at the Twin Villages probably came as a complete surprise to the German command. German intelligence had failed completely as regards the location of this division. Robertson grasped the unfolding disaster faster than almost any other American commander that morning. He suspended his attack northward toward the Siegfried Line, reversed his division's direction of march, and began the most dangerous maneuver a commander can attempt, a fighting withdrawal in contact with a pursuing enemy. His battalions leapfrogged backward through the collapsing 99th, each one forming a temporary wall, while the units behind it moved to the next position. It was a maneuver that could have become a rout at any moment. Robertson and his regimental commanders held it together through sheer force of skill and will. On the afternoon of December 17th, Dietrich committed the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend to break through the positions the Volksgrenadiers had failed to crack. The Hitlerjugend was not a formation of reluctant transferees. It was an elite panzer division, rebuilt after catastrophic losses in Normandy, fielding 136 tanks including Panthers and Panzer IVJs, plus the Panzerjäger 470s of its tank destroyer battalion. Krass sent his armor into the Krinkelterwald, expecting to smash through demoralized American remnants. What he found instead was a trap made of mud, trees, and American resourcefulness. The forest tracks were too narrow and too soft for heavy armor. Panthers, which weighed over 44 tons, sank to their road wheels in half-frozen mud. Panzer IVs slewed sideways into drainage ditches concealed by snow. The trees were so close together that tank crews could not traverse their turrets more than a few degrees without striking timber. Tanks that left the trails to bypass obstacles became trapped between tree trunks, and the infantry that was supposed to accompany the armor, the 25th SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment, could not keep pace through the deep snow. Panzers that pushed ahead without infantry escorts became vulnerable to exactly the kind of close-range ambush that American soldiers had been trained to execute. Waiting in the twin villages at the far edge of the forest were Americans from both the 2nd and 99th Divisions who had spent the night preparing. They dug in, laid anti-tank mines across every approach road, and positioned bazooka teams in upper-story windows, in root cellars, behind stone walls, and at every intersection where a tank would have to slow down to turn. The stone farmhouses of Krinkelt and Rocherath, thick-walled Belgian buildings constructed to last centuries, became individual fortresses. Each house had to be taken on its own. Each one cost the SS men and time they could not afford. At the Lousdale crossroads northeast of the village of Rocherath, beside the Albert and Francisca Palm dairy farm, Lieutenant Colonel William McKinley, a great-nephew of President William McKinley and commander of the 1st Battalion of the 9th Infantry Regiment, dug in 600 men, with orders from Robertson to hold until ordered otherwise. Through the fog of December 17th, McKinley's battalion ambushed the lead armor of the 12th SS Panzer Division with daisy-chained anti-tank mines, bazooka teams firing from ditches and farmhouse windows, and 57mm anti-tank guns positioned to catch tanks in enfilade. One German Panzerjäger was killed by a thrown jerry can of gasoline and a thermite grenade placed on its rear engine deck by an American soldier who crawled close enough to touch it. 8 German armored vehicles were destroyed at that single crossroads. The official army history credits the gunners on Elsenborn Ridge with saving McKinley's battalion when their own weapons were not enough. When McKinley was finally ordered to withdraw on the morning of December 18th, he pulled his men back through the village. His battalion had taken devastating casualties. Colonel Francis Boos of the 38th Infantry met the survivors as they filed past. "You have saved my regiment," Boos told McKinley. And there was something else hardening the American line that day, something that no tactical manual could have predicted. On December 17th, at the Baugnes crossroads 2 miles southeast of Malmedy, Piper's lead elements had captured Battery B of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. 84 American prisoners of war were machine-gunned in a snow-covered field. Word of the Malmedy massacre reached American frontline radios by evening. It changed the nature of the fighting. Men who might have considered surrender under hopeless odds now understood that surrender to S troops meant death. The defenders on Elsenborn Ridge fought with the knowledge that there was no safe way to stop fighting. The massacre did not cause the American stand, but it removed the alternative. Among McKinley's defenders was Private First Class William Soderman, a butcher from West Haven, Connecticut, born March 20th, 1912. When his bazooka loader was wounded and out of action, Soderman stood up alone in front of a column of 5 Panther tanks at dusk, fired a single rocket into the lead vehicle, and disabled it. He spent a freezing night under artillery and small arms fire. At dawn on December 18th, when 5 more tanks approached, he ran along a drainage ditch, leapt into the open, disabled the lead tank with his second rocket, and then killed 3 German infantrymen with his third round. Hours later, hearing tanks approaching a third time, he crawled forward with his last rocket, disabled another Panther, and was cut down by machine gun fire from that same tank into his right shoulder. He dragged himself along the frozen ditch to American lines. President Truman awarded him the Medal of Honor on October 12, 1945. In the same sector on December 17th, Sergeant José López, born July 10, 1910, in Santiago Ihuitlan Plumas, in the Mexican state of Oaxaca, orphaned at 8, an immigrant to Brownsville, Texas at 13, a cotton picker, a merchant marine, and a former boxer before being drafted in 1942, carried his heavy .30 caliber machine gun across open ground 3 separate times to defend the flanks of Company K, 23rd Infantry. From a shallow depression that did not cover his chest, Lopez killed over 100 German soldiers single-handedly, allowing Company K to withdraw intact. Major General James Van Fleet presented him the Medal of Honor in Nuremberg on June 18, 1945. Lopez became an American citizen, settled in San Antonio, Texas, and died on May 16, 2005. Private First Class Richard Cowan, born December 5, 1922, in Lincoln, Nebraska, raised in Wichita, Kansas, a college student who had enlisted in September 1943, held his heavy machine gun position as 7 consecutive German infantry waves, supported by a King Tiger tank, assaulted his section of the line east of Krinkelt. He fought until every man around him was dead or wounded, covered his unit's withdrawal as the last man to leave his position, and carried his machine gun back to the village. The next morning, December 17th, he was killed by enemy fire. His Medal of Honor was presented to his father, Ralph Cowan, on the White House lawn. The fighting in the twin villages of Krinkelt and Rosherath became house to house, room to room. Panther tanks drove down village streets at walking speed and were knocked out by bazooka teams firing from upper-story windows and rooftops. The reconnaissance company of the 644th Tank Destroyer Battalion fought off a German attempt to seize the stone church on the northern edge of Rosherath. Sherman tanks from the 741st Tank Battalion engaged Panthers at ranges so short that both vehicles were destroyed in the exchange. Men on both sides were captured and recaptured as positions changed hands through the night. American soldiers threw thermite grenades onto the engine decks of tanks that ground past their foxholes. German Panzer grenadiers kicked in farmhouse doors and were met by rifle fire from men crouching behind overturned furniture in the dark. Among the officers fighting in the Krinkelterwald was Captain Charles MacDonald, a 22-year-old company commander leading Company 1 of the 3rd Battalion, 23rd Infantry, 2nd Division. His company was overrun east of Krinkelt on December 17th. MacDonald and his first sergeant, a career soldier and the oldest man in Company 1, escaped across country through German patrols and reached American lines. MacDonald survived the war and became a military historian for the United States Army. In 1985, he published the definitive account of the Battle of the Bulge. He called it A Time for Trumpets. The heart of that book is devoted to the northern shoulder, to the twin villages, and to the ridge where MacDonald himself had fought and bled as a young captain 4 decades earlier. No other major history of the Bulge was written by a man who had been there in a rifle company. When Colonel Boos radioed Lieutenant Colonel Frank Mildren's command post in the 1st Battalion of the 38th Infantry to ask how close the German tanks were, a young officer at the post answered, as a Panther rumbled past the building outside, that if he went up to the 2nd floor, he could relieve himself out the window and hit at least 6. 21 German armored vehicles were destroyed by bazooka teams in the twin villages on December 18th alone. Another 27 fell to anti-tank guns and mines. The stone buildings of Krinkelt and Rosherath, which had sheltered Belgian farm families for centuries, became what the Tank Museum's analysis calls a Panzer graveyard. In 3 days of close combat in the twin villages, the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend lost 67 of its 136 tanks. It was one of the finest armored formations remaining in the German military, and it burned itself out trying to take 2 Belgian farming villages from American infantry that would not leave. But the infantry did leave, not because it was beaten, because it was ordered to. On December 19th, Robertson, with 5th Corps Commander Major General Leonard Guerreau's approval, ordered the abandonment of Krinkelt and Rosherath and the consolidation of all forces on Elsenborn Ridge itself. The decision was agonizing. Hundreds of American wounded lay in the cellars of the twin villages. Vehicles, weapons, and equipment that could not be moved would fall into German hands. But Robertson understood that the villages were a trap for his own forces as much as for the enemy. The ridge behind him was the ground that mattered. The ridge was where the artillery could reach everything in front of it. The ridge was where the defense could hold indefinitely. Through the late afternoon and night of December 19th, surviving battalions of the 2nd and 99th Divisions filtered back along a muddy 4-kilometer trail to the high ground. Engineers blew bridges behind them. Vehicles that could not make the trail were destroyed in place, their fuel drained, and their engine blocks cracked with thermite. The 741st Tank Battalion formed the rearguard, its Shermans backing slowly through the darkness with their guns trained east. At Hoofen, Butler's 3rd Battalion of the 395th had not moved an inch. It anchored the northern end of the new line as the rest of the defense consolidated around it. By December 20th, the two battered American divisions, now reinforced by the arriving 1st Infantry Division on the southern flank and the 9th Infantry Division on the northern flank, were dug into the ridge with their backs to the open Belgian countryside and their guns trained east. The position was compact, elevated, and covered by interlocking fields of fire. Every approach was pre-registered by the artillery. Every tree line was zeroed. For the first time since December 16th, the Americans were not reacting. They were waiting. And now the battle entered its final and most devastating phase. Because Elsenborn Ridge was not merely a defensive position, it was an artillery fortress. And the weapon that broke the 6th Panzer Army was not the rifle, not the bazooka, not the Sherman tank. It was the proximity fuse. By December 19th, 5th Corps had massed the artillery of 4 infantry divisions, the 1st, 2nd, 9th, and 99th, plus corps-level battalions, on and around Elsenborn Ridge. More than 300 tubes, 105mm howitzers, 155mm howitzers, 4.2-inch chemical mortars, and 8-inch guns. They were lined up nearly wheel to wheel behind the crest of the ridge, and they were firing a weapon the German ground forces had never encountered. The VT proximity fuse, designated POZIT, was a miniature radar transmitter built into the nose of an artillery shell. Instead of exploding on impact with the ground or at a preset altitude, the shell detected the surface beneath it and detonated at the optimal height to spray shrapnel downward across the widest possible area. For defenders in foxholes, the effect was survivable. For infantry attacking in the open across snow-covered fields with no overhead cover, it was annihilation. American gunners fired these shells in time on target concentrations, where every battery timed its firing so that the first rounds from every gun arrived simultaneously on the target. On December 20th and 21st, Dietrich threw the remnants of the 12th SS Panzer, the 12th Volksgrenadier, and elements of the freshly committed 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division at the ridge. Each attack broke under massed American artillery before it reached the American foxholes. The 26th Infantry Regiment of the 1st Infantry Division, dug in at Dom Boutgenbach on the southern shoulder, repulsed every German assault. American grave registration teams counted 782 German dead in front of the 26th's positions alone. 47 German tanks were destroyed in that sector. The 613th Tank Destroyer Battalion, equipped with the new M36 Jackson mounting a 90mm gun, broke a heavy 12th SS armored attack on December 21st. On December 22nd, the heaviest single day of artillery firing in the battle, American gunners on Elsenborn Ridge fired 10,000 rounds. The 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division, committed fresh from reserve, lost 15 tanks and assault guns in a single day, trying to cross the open ground below the ridge. On December 26th, the 246th Volksgrenadier Division, the last fresh formation Dietrich possessed, made a final attack against the 99th Division's positions. It was destroyed by artillery fire virtually at the moment of its start. The next day, Dietrich gave up. The 6th Panzer Army's offensive on the northern shoulder was over. It had not advanced 6 miles past the German border. Hitler reluctantly redirected reinforcements south to General Hasso von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army, which had achieved partial success in the center. A grenadier of the 277th Volksgrenadier Division reportedly wrote in his diary on Christmas Day that it was a sad Christmas with no food, that the only water they had come from a foxhole, and that there were only a few men left in the battalion. As the National World War II Museum's analysis concluded, there was simply no way that anything could or ever would penetrate the ring of steel formed by the American infantry and their supporting artillery. Now consider what the Germans had expected. They had planned to break through the 99th Division, which they regarded as green and brittle, in a matter of hours. They had expected to release their SS Panzer divisions through the gap and reach the Meuse in 2 days. They had budgeted 7 days to reach Antwerp. Instead, they spent 10 days battering against a ridge they never took, losing tanks they could never replace, veterans who could never be rebuilt, and hours they could never recover, against a division the American press had mocked as the battle babies. 60 miles to the south, that same week, another Green American division proved the cost of the alternative. The 106th Infantry Division, the Golden Lions, had been in the line for exactly 5 days when the German 5th Panzer Army struck it in the Schnee-Eifel. The 106th had been bled of more than 12,000 of its best-trained soldiers during stateside training and refilled with raw replacements days before shipping overseas. Its commander, Major General Alan Jones, had never led troops in combat. Its 2 forward regiments, the 422nd and the 423rd Infantry, were caught in a salient with thin, exposed flanks and no adjacent veteran division to lean on. When the Germans applied infiltration tactics, bypassing strongpoints and slipping through the morning fog, both regiments were surrounded within 48 hours. On December 19th, approximately 7,000 American soldiers surrendered. The official Army history calls it the most serious reverse suffered by American arms during the operations of 1944 to 1945 in the European theatre. Both divisions were green. The 99th had been in the line for 37 days, the 106th for 5. The 99th had the veteran 2nd Division on its western flank, and Robertson's masterly fighting withdrawal gave it time to consolidate. The 106th had the partially collapsed 14th Cavalry Group on one side and the overextended 28th Infantry Division on the other. Neither neighbor could help. The 99th had concentrated artillery behind it, on ground that gave the guns clear fields of fire. The 106th had its artillery still settling into positions with no comparable high ground. The 99th had Walter Lauer, a combat veteran of North Africa. The 106th had Major General Alan Jones, who had never led troops under fire. The comparison is not meant to dishonor the men of the 106th, who fought bravely in circumstances that would have overwhelmed most units on Earth. The 422nd and 423rd Infantry did not surrender because they were cowards. They surrendered because they were surrounded, out of ammunition, out of food, and out of options, in a salient that should never have been held. But the contrast illuminates the variables that determined whether a Green Division survived or broke in December 1944. Preparation, adjacent support, terrain, artillery, and the depth of small unit leadership, the number of men at the squad level who could make decisions when no one above them was available to make them. Manteuffel, the 5th Panzer Army commander who had crushed the 106th, argued after the war that just a fraction of Dietrich's combat power transferred south to his own army or to Brandenberger's 7th Army would have yielded far greater results than grinding against the northern shoulder. Historians have overwhelmingly agreed. Hitler's insistence on giving the main effort to his oldest SS comrade, on the worst terrain against what became the strongest American defensive position of the Bulge, was a strategic miscalculation that wasted the offensive's best resources. In his post-war interrogation at Bad Mondorf, Luxembourg, Dietrich was evasive and tight-lipped. He distanced himself from Hitler, claimed he had told the Führer the operation could not succeed, and insisted he had been given insufficient time and fuel. His own Chief of Staff Kramer contradicted him, noting that detailed planning had begun weeks before Dietrich later claimed he learned of the attack. What no German general addressed directly was the fundamental problem that historians would later identify. Dietrich had been handed the strongest formations in the offensive and pointed them at the one sector where terrain, American artillery, and defensive depth made a breakthrough nearly impossible. But strategy did not matter to the men on the ridge. What mattered was whether you could hold a machine gun steady with frozen hands. What mattered was whether the sergeant in the next foxhole knew what to do if you went down. What mattered was whether your training had prepared you to act when the plan was gone, and the officers were gone, and the only thing left was the ground under your feet, and the decision to hold it or leave it. The men of the 99th held it. Lyle Bauch and his surviving platoon members spent the rest of the war in German prisoner-of-war camps. After liberation, Bouck returned to St. Louis, earned a degree, and became a chiropractor. For 37 years, nobody outside his platoon knew what had happened on that hilltop above Lanzerath. The army had lost the paperwork. Bouck spent decades writing letters, tracking down fellow survivors, and lobbying for recognition. In 1981, the army finally reviewed the case. 4 men, Bouck, Tsakanikas, Slape, and Sergeant George Redmond, received the Distinguished Service Cross. 5 received the Silver Star. 9 received the Bronze Star. The intelligence and reconnaissance platoon of the 394th Infantry became the most decorated American platoon for a single action in the entire Second World War. Bouck told the press, "We were frightened, and we were tired, and it was like a hellish nightmare. It seemed it would never end. We could not get any help. It seemed like it was all hopeless." It was not hopeless. It was the system working exactly as designed. The 99th Division did not stop fighting after Elsenborn. It held the ridge through January 1945, patrolling aggressively and absorbing replacements. In 151 days of combat, the division earned 1 Medal of Honor and, according to division records, 16 Distinguished Service Crosses, more than 250 Silver Stars, and thousands of Bronze Stars. On February 1st, it attacked into the Monschau forest. On March 11, 1945, the 99th became the first complete Allied division to cross the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen over the Rhine River, then fought off German counterattacks attempting to retake the bridge. It fought in the Ruhr pocket, capturing thousands of German prisoners, and on May 3 and 4, 1945, advancing into Bavaria, the men of the 99th opened the gates of subcamps of the Dachau concentration camp system near Möhldorf. They found 1,500 Jewish prisoners living in conditions so terrible that 600 required immediate hospitalization for starvation and disease. The men who had stood on the ridge and broken Hitler's panzers now stood in a concentration camp and saw what the regime behind those panzers had built. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum formally recognized the 99th Infantry Division as a liberating unit in 1992. The division was inactivated on September 27, 1945, at Camp Patrick Henry, Virginia. Its lineage survives today in the 99th Readiness Division of the United States Army Reserve, headquartered at Joint Base McGuire, Dix, and Lakehurst in New Jersey. From the frozen ridge where it broke the 6th Panzer Army, to the bridge at Remagen where it crossed the Rhine, to the camp at Möhldorf where it freed the dying, the 99th Infantry Division traveled an arc that no insult, no nickname, and no German Panzer Army could define. 5th Corps Commander Major General Leonard Guerreau sent a written commendation to Lauer. "I wish to express to you and the members of your command my appreciation and commendation for the fine job you did in preventing the enemy from carrying out his plans to break through the 5th Corps sector and push on to the Meuse River. Not only did your command assist in effectively frustrating that particular part of the plan, but it also inflicted such heavy losses on the enemy that he was unable to carry out other contemplated missions in other sectors of the Allied front. The division lost 20% of its effective strength in 5 days, 465 killed, more than 2,500 evacuated, for wounds, frostbite, or combat fatigue. Total bulge casualties for the 99th were over 6,000. It bent, it bled, but it did not break. Sepp Dietrich spent 10 years in Landsberg prison after the war for his role in the Malmedy massacre, in which troops under his command murdered 84 American prisoners of war at the Boniez Crossroads on December 17th, the same day his panzers were dying in the streets of Krinkelt. He was released in 1955 and died in Ludwigsburg on April 21, 1966. He never publicly acknowledged what the battle babies had cost him. Elsenborn Ridge is still a Belgian military training area today. The foxholes are gone. The forest has grown back over the craters, the artillery carved into the hillside. The villages of Krinkelt and Rocherath have been rebuilt, stone by stone, their farmhouse walls patched over the holes where bazookas once fired. The Lausdell Crossroads, where McKinley's battalion fought and bled, is a quiet pasture again. The hilltop above Lanzerath, where Bouck held for 20 hours, is covered in young pines that have had 80 years to grow, where no trees stood that December. But if you walk the ground in winter, when the snow covers the open fields below the ridge, and the wind cuts through the pines the way it did when those men were alive, you can see what the German tank commanders saw when they emerged from the forest edge and looked uphill at what was waiting for them: the long, exposed approaches with no cover and no defilade, the tree lines where the bazooka teams crouched in the dark, the high ground where 300 American guns stood wheel to wheel, loaded with proximity fuse shells, their crews watching the valley below. And you can understand, standing there in the cold, why nothing came through. The German 6th Panzer Army could not crack the battle babies at Elsenborn for the same reason a hammer cannot crack water. The blow lands, the surface gives, and then the water closes around the fist and holds it still. Thank you for spending these minutes with these men. If this story reached you, a like is the single best way to help it find others who care about this history. If you are not subscribed, now is a good time, and the bell ensures you never miss one of these. I would love to hear where you are watching from today, and if someone in your family served in the Battle of the Bulge, or in any theatre of the Second World War, a father, a grandfather, an uncle, a neighbor whose stories you grew up hearing, tell me about them in the comments. Every one of those men carried a story like the ones you just heard. Most of them never told it. This is how we make sure they are not forgotten.